There is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Zelda is, tonally speaking, and this wasn't more clear than with the announcement of The Wind Waker in 2001. That's a lackluster applause. The Zelda fanbase took this disappointment with grace and understanding.
What the hell was Nintendo
This has
thinking?
gotta be some kind of joke. Maybe it's all a dream, and when I wake up in the morning,
believe
they
they
did
did
that Zelda
game.
that looks like a friggin'
What the
puppet
hell?
show.
Why?
from
Why?
5-year-olds.
What have they done?
Maybe
That's
it's all
not
a dream.
the
when I
joy. This
wake
might be
up
my
in the morning,
biggest
it'll all be
disappointment
good.
coming out of the cube ever.
Why does Link look like a girl? Here's a hard truth to admit about the Zelda franchise as a whole. Zelda is campy. Honestly, I don't know how we didn't admit this earlier. For those who may not know what I mean when I say campy or camp, here's a definition. Camp. Deliberately exaggerated and theatrical in style, typically for humorous effect. It's not always for humorous effect, like the 1960s Batman TV show wasn't supposed to be funny, but it was the epitome of camp. Just about everything in the 1960s was that way. I've made this argument with my Link to the Past video, and each game after shows how campy Zelda can get. Link's Awakening has a village full of eccentric animal citizens. Ocarina of Time has its own cast of kooky characters and silly jokes. Even the darkest Zelda game, Majora's Mask, has plenty of moments of levity and tomfoolery. As dark and serious this franchise can get, it is equally as goofy and slapstick. And it's always worked. It's campy in both directions with humor and melodrama. That's what Zelda is. Back to that Wind Waker announcement. Everyone was expecting something darker, grittier. That Link Ganon sword fight demo at Space World 2000 got a lot of people's hopes up for that next-gen Zelda title. And instead, we got this the following year. People seem to have taken that pretty well. Discourse was skeptical at best, insanely hostile at worst, as you saw a moment ago. Good to know the internet hasn't changed much these past 20 years. Not many were thrilled. But here's the thing. This honestly made the most sense for Zelda to move forward. Not just because the graphics could become timeless, while other games of the era now really show their age. It allowed the developers to lean into the qualities that make Zelda, Zelda. And part of that is the camp. April 2000. Majora's Mask released in Japan. The North American version would be a holiday release later in the year. The team's work on the title was complete. The rest would be left to the localizers. A core group of Nintendo devs immediately got to work on brainstorming ideas for the next Zelda title for the Nintendo GameCube. Eiji Aonuma would direct once again. The reins to the Zelda franchise had been passed down. This was his franchise now.
Look at me, sure. Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
Koizumi, who was instrumental to the development of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, wouldn't join the project. He would be moved over to the Mario team, taking over that franchise. Among his core group were graphic designers Satoru Takizawa and Yoshiki Hauhana. Both had joined Nintendo at about the same time at the end of the SNES era. Hauhana worked as an illustrator for Kirby's Dream Course and Yoshi's Island. He was in charge of map design for Mario 64, the GUI for Star Fox 64, and did enemy and character design for Ocarina of Time. He designed Zelda, the Skulltulas, and Lizalfos. Takizawa was right there with Hauhana for most of these projects. He designed the Yoshi's Island logo for international release, enemy design for Mario 64 and Star Fox 64, and was a character designer for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. If there was anyone who should be in charge of art direction for the next Zelda title, it was these two. The team had hastily made the Ganondorf Link demo fight for Space World 2000, but Aonuma hated it. The rest of the team weren't quite feeling the vibe either. They were struggling to come up with fresh new ideas to push the franchise forward. That realistic aesthetic just wasn't inspiring them. What they were coming up with felt like another Ocarina of Time game, and Aonuma didn't want to just make it again. Takizawa and Hirohana felt the same way. Inspiration wasn't hitting. Miyamoto and the other higher-ups wanted quicker turnarounds for their titles, so the pressure was on. The team had to get inspired fast. Their luck quickly changed thanks to Hirohana. Out of the blue, he drew a very stylized, cartoonish-looking Link. No. There we are, that's it. That's what he drew. Takizawa was immediately inspired. He quickly drew a Moblin in the same style, and the team began brimming with ideas about how Link would move, how combat would work, how the world would look. Ideas quickly coalesced once passion was ignited. There was an issue, though. The audience was expecting something more in line to the Space World demo. Also, Miyamoto and the other Nintendo execs were expecting the same thing. Aonuma kept this design direction a secret for a while, just at least until they had something of substance to show first. He knew Miyamoto would probably put the kibosh on it, so he kept the king of Nintendo at bay until he could have a demo to show the true potential of the style. While this isn't the design direction the consumer was expecting, in reality it fit the Zelda style more than photorealism ever would. Weaknesses and secrets could be better telegraphed and communicated visually with that style. More life could be injected into the characters and movement, and Link's actions felt crunchier and more kinetic. It was cool. Once the game got in players' hands, just about every doubt melted away. It played like a Zelda game and felt like a Zelda game. And this isn't thanks to, not in spite of, its art direction. The thing that would truly hold back Wind Waker is the same thing that held back Super Mario Sunshine: a rushed development timeline. The openness of the overworld in Zelda games had been expanding and contracting with each title. The original on the NES was a pretty open world. Zelda 2 became very linear. A Link to the Past was a mix of both, leaning towards that openness. And Link's Awakening leaned into the linear with a Metroidvania-like design to its overworld, which Capcom would take notice of and do the same for their Oracle games. Ocarina of Time was fairly open, with just about every area available once you completed the Deku Tree, save Gerudo Desert, which would open up in the adult timeline. Majora's Mask went back to linear, with each area opening up one after the other. So the question became, how is the overworld going to work in the GameCube title? Open world games weren't new in the early 2000s. Obviously, Zelda was an open world game. It's just that they were more reserved for niche RPGs like Ultima. That is, until Grand Theft Auto 3 hit the PS2 in 2001. The sandbox nature of the game was extremely appealing. Grand Theft Auto 3 isn't the first open world game. The other Grand Theft Autos were also open world, but GTA 3 did it differently. It was so good, The Simpsons even copied it for one of their licensed titles. So with open world games becoming more ubiquitous, Wind Waker would lean more into the openness of earlier Zelda titles. Aonuma wanted to bring back that excitement of discovery that the original Zelda had on the NES. In addition to that, Nintendo was always trying to figure out how to do something fun, unique, and original with a wind mechanic. Something they've experimented with in the original Super Mario Bros. 2 back in 1986. With the cartoony style, showing wind was going to be a lot easier. The next Zelda's overworld will be set on the open sea, and Link would travel by sailboat with the power to control the winds. What we got was an expansive ocean, dotted with islands and towns across the map. There were pirate encounters, sunken treasure to find, giant sea monsters to battle with. Fun fact, if you move in a zigzag pattern against the wind, you can still slowly sail across the sea. This is something that can be literally done in real life. It was added to the game because someone on the dev team said this was a known sailing technique, and kids in the US have to take sailing classes as part of their schooling, and would know about the technique, and were definitely going to try to do this to sail against the wind. So it had to be in there because a lot of people were going to try and do it, and it was a pain to program. I, as an American, never took a single sailing class at my school. I learned about this technique when prepping for this video and reading about how much trouble it was to implement. The world will be laid out as a 7x7 grid, with something new to discover on each square. The exploration of the open overworld of the original Zelda would fit right in with the setting for the Wind Waker. Couple of problems. First, design trends of the time still like to put limits on the player, even in an open world game. In GTA 3, you couldn't reach the next part of Liberty City until you completed a certain amount of missions. Honestly, this makes a lot of sense. By opening up too much, you risk overwhelming the player. paralysis by too many choices. But at least GTA limited the player in an organic way through the bridge explosion at the start of the game. Wind Waker limits you through your sentient boat, the King of Red Lions. He'll just stop and say, "Hey!" No. You don't get true full exploration until the second half of the game. Having the limitation and guided tour to these first two dungeons does help ease the player into how the overworld will work. You'll get to explore small islands as you go to the main ones where the dungeons are. You'll run into salvagers and learn about the treasure maps and salvaging. It's smart, it really is. But I don't like artificial constraints. Having an open sea makes it hard to put organic limits on the player like GTA 3 did. I get it. They could put an enemy, an object, a literal barrier of some kind, like fog or a magical barrier, something that I'll need a later acquired item or accomplish a story beat to remove the barrier. That way it doesn't feel like the designer is ripping the controller from my hands. Second, the hardware limited what the developers could populate the world with, and it limited the speed of your boat. In order to make for seamless loading as you travel the sea, islands had to be a certain distance apart from each other, and the boat could only go so fast as to not travel past what the game could load in time. There'd be large swaths of time with nothing to really find or do as you would travel from island to island. This slowed traversal way down and made it kind of boring. And a lot of the islands were really small with not a lot to find or do. There were those few big islands to explore, like your home of Outset Island, the town of Windfall Island, and then there was Dragon Roost and Forest Haven. Don't mistake this as me saying there was nothing to do on this overworld. There was plenty to find and plenty to do. Some islands had really interesting and fun puzzles to solve. There were pirate ships to fight, the submarines to board, sunken treasure to find. The weather would change and you'd find yourself sailing through rough, stormy seas. It was a really cool world. It's just that the hardware limitations of the time hampered the fun a bit. The HD version on the Wii U did fix some of this with the quick sail. It sped up travel and didn't require you to change the wind direction every time you wanted to change your trajectory. It was a nice addition that just wasn't possible in the 2003 original, 2002 in Japan. But even though that sped up travel, the original hardware and crunched development time really limited what Ionuma's team could populate the map with. But despite these shortcomings, there was a lot of creativity shown in this overworld. By this third entry in the 3D Zeldas, the team was getting a good handle on how to create unique and interesting dungeons, though they may have leaned a little too much on the linear this go around. While Dragon Roost Cavern is the official first dungeon, really it's your first visit to the Forsaken Fortress that acts as a dungeon tutorial. You temporarily lose your sword, so you have to hide from the searchlights and the moblins to avoid getting caught. You have to pay better attention to enemy movements and patterns and learn how to block to disarm an enemy and use his own weapon against him. You'll also have to use some of the new mechanics in Link's movement, like wall sliding, rope swinging, and hiding in a barrel, though the last one is kind of exclusive to this portion of the game. The fortress is a pretty straightforward mini-dungeon that has you going inside and outside, learning how the dungeon is laid out and how to navigate a 3D space by understanding the layout of the whole. On the surface, it may seem boring and straightforward, but it helps you learn how to keep the map in your head on a small scale before you get thrown into the main dungeons on a large scale. Like Ocarina of Time, the first half of dungeons are more straightforward than the latter half. The last two add an interesting idea where you have a companion that aids you in puzzle solving and traversing the dungeon. It's a really cool idea, and I like how the designers made use of Makar and Medley in these dungeons. You have to not only know where you are in the space, but how to position your companion in relation to Link as well. It's rad. I want to take a quick look at that first dungeon, Dragon Roost Cavern. By the time you get to this dungeon, the game has taught you quite a few things. Enemies can be disarmed and their weapons picked up, used, and even thrown. Deco sticks are now a weapon instead of a consumable item. You learn how push-pull blocks work and what they look like, and what bombable boulders look like. You've already been taught and tested on a small repertoire of mechanics. So when you enter the first room, the game can teach you how dungeons will work, and introduce dungeon-specific mechanics and puzzles. We see Nintendo leaning into some of their Kishu Tenketsu design philosophy in this first dungeon. Introduce an idea, expand on it, put a twist on it, bring it all together. To know more about Kishu Tenketsu, watch my Super Mario Odyssey video. While they don't use this formula like later games, elements are present. We see this in the first room. You are blocked in until you defeat the bokoblins and use your lit Deku sticks to light some lanterns to make the key chest appear. There are also some water jars that, while useless in this room, show you a new jar type that you should take notice of. The dungeon guides you to a room where you have to use that jar to create a platform on the lava. The next room, a bokoblin jumps out of a jar and smashes through wood beams that your normal sword isn't strong enough to break. Use his sword to break the next set of beams to continue. You've now been introduced to a few ideas. Water jars, Deku sticks, strong wooden beams. The next set of wooden beams, you don't get a strong sword from a bokoblin, but a Deku stick. Light it on the torch to set fire to the beams. The next set of wooden beams you can't reach, so you have to throw your lit Deku stick. We now switch back to the water jugs, which we use to create a platform on a lava pillar to ascend. The game taught us all we need to know to put these ideas together. At this time, we are given the dungeon item, the grappling hook. We are introduced to its use in a safe manner. Then it's expanded on. Then it's twisted on when using the hook to pull a switch, and concluded with a puzzle having to stop mid-swing to change directions. Later dungeons will better utilize the dungeon item in conjunction with the specific mechanics, but Dragon Roost Cavern is an excellent introduction to new ideas for new players. The layout for dungeons is very similar to Ocarina's. Each dungeon has a central room that is used to help orient the player from getting too lost. They act as a kind of wheel and spoke. You'll often crisscross through this main section to the different sections of the dungeon. Dragon Roost Cavern not only has you going off on each spoke, but also exiting and re-entering the dungeon as you scale the mountainside, giving you the feeling of climbing the mountain, and requiring you to understand the space. If you exited the dungeon at this height and re-entered at another, you should now be able to get to that previously unreachable section. Even with the two that don't have the wheel and spoke layout, Tower of the Gods and the Earth Temple, they have an element of it, but instead are each divided into two distinct sections. The Tower of the Gods, the lower part of the dungeon, has you solving rooms on each side of the temple, so you can then raise the water level. You then ascend to the second half of the dungeon, where you learn the command melody, and need to navigate the statues to activate switches to ascend to the boss room, where you find, hey, a head-in-hand boss again! Why does Nintendo love this boss idea? Like, they love it! The Earth Temple is very similar. Complete the two sections of the first half to get the Mirror Shield. Use it and medley to activate the Sun statue, and then work your way through the second section. The last dungeon is the most complicated dungeon, the Wind Temple. While it has the wheel and spoke design with this large central wind tunnel room, navigating the dungeon has you ascending and descending the wind tunnel to find your way through. It's honestly the most interesting dungeon in the game because of that. I don't fault this game for its more linear approach in navigating the dungeons, because the puzzles are engaging and interesting. And by making the dungeon a little bit more linear, it's able to fold in on itself. So as you complete sections, it creates shortcuts through the dungeon, so backtracking, if you miss something, isn't as much of a chore. And each dungeon has unique and fun mechanics. The Deku Baba flowers make traversal interesting in the Forbidden Forest, along with using the Deku leaf to propel you on these platforms. Tower of the Gods has these light bridges and platforms. You need to understand how to activate them with the switches and statues. And Medley and Makar are utilized really well in the Earth and Wind Temples, helping you solve your way through. As tedious as the last light puzzle may be in the Earth Temple, I felt really accomplished in solving that one. Even though you could argue it's a little straightforward, it was an interesting use of the companion character that put together everything you had learned through the temple. Most of the Wind Waker's dungeons are really straightforward affairs, completing one section of the dungeon before moving on to the next. You're never really asked to figure out the layout to find your way through. In most of the dungeons, you get the map within the first 3 rooms you visit. Locked doors and keys this go around aren't going to be about finding your way through the labyrinth. Rather, the locked doors act as a skill check, and finding the key shows you are mastering the mechanics that the dungeon is introducing. To keep the player from getting overwhelmed, it seems the designers decided to use locks and keys as a way to make sure you understand the mechanics before being shown a more difficult version of the idea. That's the puzzle design and dungeon layout, but what about the items? Wind Waker mainly relies on the staples, with a couple new ones. Boomerang, bow and arrow, bombs, hookshot, oversized hammer, iron boots, mirror shield, they all make their comeback. The grappling hook and Deku leaf are the new entries. The grappling hook allows you to swing on certain beams, and the Deku leaf gives Link the ability to glide, tied to a magic meter, and to create wind gusts. Combine that with the launching capabilities of the Deku Baba flowers.
Baby, you got a stew going.
Yes, I miss you, Carl Weathers. What Wind Waker does well is its ability to recontextualize some of the items, combine item uses throughout the game, and utilize the item in the dungeon's boss fights. The grappling hook is used to swing and sometimes activate switches, and you can also use it to steal items from enemies. The Deku Leaf can be used to propel an object, or push a fan to propel the object, as well as glide. The Boomerang can now hit up to 5 targets at a time. The Iron Boots aren't used to sink Link to the bottom of a body of water this time, but keep him grounded in high winds. And if he's wearing them when using the hookshot, he doesn't fly up to the object, it comes crashing down to him. They're also used to compress springs to launch Link into the air. The Mirror Shield isn't just needed to solve puzzles, but to defeat Pose. They can only be defeated after being exposed to light. The hammer is not only needed to smash giant pegs, but to kill stealth foes as well. Whacking them with your sword makes their bodies collapse with their head bouncing around like mad.
Smash it with a hammer!
Where the item use shines is in the boss battles, making them unique and interesting fights, in my opinion at least. The grappling hook was used in the Goma fight to grab the dragon's tail and bring rocks crashing on her head, cracking her hard outer shell. Kali Demos isn't wholly original, it's very similar to Baronade and Ocarina of Time. But with the Boomerang's new ability to target multiple vines at a time makes for an interesting trade-off of remaining locked on and having greater mobility versus having slower, more precise movement with a narrow field of view for a moment to target the vines before letting that sucker fly. Godan, well, he's a head and hands boss again. Shoot the eye hands with arrows. Shoot the eyes in the head with arrows. But since his design is very similar to the Armos Knight's, his disabled head doesn't just get whacked with a sword, you have to plant bombs in his agaped mouth. So, that's new at least. Halmara King needs to have his head smashed in with a hammer. Okay, wow, that's a violent way to say that now that I've said it out loud. Let me see if there's another way I could phrase this. Halmara King needs to have his skull cracked open with the hammer. Nope, that's not better. That's not better. Jalhala has to be stunned with the Mirror Shield, a mechanic you would have learned earlier in the temple, and then thrown into spikes where he bursts into a bunch of tiny Poes that you defeat one at a time, or in small batches. Bulgara is an interesting take on the Morpha fight. Instead of waiting for the brain to come up a tentacle, you have to wait for him to expose his tongue, though you will need to deal with the mini Mulgaras by using the hookshot to bring them out of the sand. Ganon's fight brings a lot of these things together, utilizing the Boomerang, light arrows, managing the magic meter, and ending with a sword fight where you use the Mirror Shield to deflect Zelda's light arrows, and then utilizing that new parry mechanic introduced in this game for the final blow. Wind Waker's dungeons, items, enemies, and bosses are all both familiar and new. And while the dungeons themselves may be mostly straightforward in navigating, the puzzle ideas and progression, they're better honed in. And the boss fights are interesting with your needed task better telegraphed because of this colorful, cartoony art direction. So bringing this all together, what does this art direction have to do with the Zelda vibe? A lot. The totality of the Zelda vibe is its tone mixed with its design and mechanics. The characters are much more expressive and unique. It's very easy to tell the strength and threat of an enemy based on its cartoony design. And the goofier moments land a lot better with this cartoony style. Like with the dancing Mandan Windfall and the feuding brothers in Outset. I love those guys. Twilight Princess still has these campy moments, but there's something off with that more realistic design. It comes across sillier than it should be and creepier than it needs to be. What is wrong with this kid's head? And if you look at how the Nintendo 64 characters were modeled, thanks to the low poly count and the system limits of the hardware, that style and aesthetic translated perfectly to the Wind Waker's cel-shaded look. By embracing a cartoonish look, actions and movements could be greater exaggerated, making for more detailed combat. Link is very expressive in his fighting, and added to his swordplay is a simple parry mechanic. If you aren't guarding with a shield, an exclamation type sound will play and the action button will become a star for a moment, letting you know you have a second to do a special move that either does extra damage, disarms your enemy, or in the case of the Dark Nuts, is necessary to chip off their armor to defeat them. When their weapon is flung out of their hands, they helplessly look for it for a moment. It's priceless. Look at him run. Look at him just scurry over there to get a new sword. I love it. With a cel-shaded look, Koji Kondo and the other composers and sound designers could add a lot of flair and crunch. Each hit in combat, a quick chord plays as part of a progression in tune with Link's combo. For a while, this game was viewed as the outlier for its graphical direction, but if you look at the Zelda franchise as a whole, really Twilight Princess is the black sheep with its realistic aesthetic. Even though Skyward Sword and the two Switch titles don't go as hard into the cartoony look, they have more in common with Wind Waker than it appears. In 2002, fans were hoping for something darker, grittier, and more realistic looking. But that's not Zelda. That never was Zelda. Even the Nintendo 64 games had bold colors and cartoonish looking characters. Zelda is fun, not just in action but in tone. It leans into the camp in every aspect, with both the comedy and the drama. It always has. Dark, gritty, and realistic doesn't equal good and mature. It just equals dark, gritty, and realistic. And Zelda is none of those things. Okay, well, maybe a little dark. Quickly offset with melodrama and slapstick hysteria. It was always a fun adventure with high stakes and heart. Zelda was always supposed to be approached with a childlike wonder and whimsy. The danger was always supposed to be real, but it was never supposed to be scary. Okay, maybe a little scary. And unnerving. Oh my gosh, kill it with fire! Kill it! Kill it with fire! Kill it with fire! The Wind Waker still does deal with heavy themes of loss and what it means to grow up and become a man. The cartoony style didn't take away from any of that. It enhanced it. Link could better wear his emotions on his sleeve. Leaving on his adventure to rescue his sister is both exciting and sad, and the expression on his face says it all. Also, look at how the Ganondorf fight ends in this game. Link drives the Master Sword through his forehead. He drives the Master Sword through his forehead. Holy shit! The biggest issue the Wind Waker faced wasn't the backlash to the art style. In reality, it was how long and expensive game development was becoming this new era of high-fidelity 3D gaming. I mentioned earlier how Nintendo wanted shorter development times for their titles. It was 7 years between Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. At least Link's Awakening came out for the Game Boy in '93, but still, that's a 5-year gap between Zelda titles. At least Mario was routinely releasing games of some kind during his hiatus in the second half of the 90s. In 2002, they kind of needed to get content out there quicker. By the end of the year, the PlayStation 2 was kicking everyone's butt, and Microsoft was only 100,000 units behind the GameCube sales. Nintendo needed content that sold consoles, and they needed it fast. Mario and Zelda were their biggest titles from the Nintendo 64, so they needed those now. Corners would be cut. It showed with Super Mario Sunshine and its padded shines and lack of courses. It would also show with the Wind Waker. The Great Sea was kind of sparse, partly due to the hardware constraints. And 2 dungeons would get axed and replaced with the Triforce Hunt to pad the time in the game. These hunts were becoming quite the trope for Nintendo at the time. It is plainly obvious the Wind Waker is kind of an incomplete game. That's the biggest thing it has against it. What's there, though, is still a lot of fun, filled with a ton of charm. The cel-shaded cartoony look wasn't working against the Wind Waker at all, and it didn't become a blight on the Zelda franchise that a lot of people worried about back in 2001. It had that Zelda-ness feel to the whole game because of that style. And it's this game, its design choices, both mechanically and artistically, that would go on to influence the Zelda games that would change the franchise's entire trajectory, and eventually gaming as a whole as well.